And it's also that perception of it's hot in here, the patient may be too hot, too cold, or vice versa, that we may say it's really hot in here, the patient may be fine, but on that table, well, if we have colder fluids running, the patient may be actually dropping their temperature significantly, even for a short procedure. And there's a guideline that lays this out really well from APIC called Understanding the OR Environment. And it's really, so if you listen to this episode and you're like, I want to kind of deep dive into this is a really helpful implementation guide about temperature, humidity, air handling, all in that OR setting.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now, it's time to roll back and start the first case.
On this week's episode of First Case, we're tackling the topic of room temperature and patient temperature management with Garret Hollenbeak, System Infection Preventionist at Secours Mercy Health, and also the editor-in-chief of our sister podcast, Transmission Control. Is a cold OR really the best for patient safety and infection prevention? We're going to discuss this thought process and the science behind OR temperature management in today's interview, so don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with Garret Hollenbeak.
Hi, I'm Chris Blevins.
And I'm Melanie Perry.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to First Case.
On this week's episode of First Case, we are speaking with Garret Hollenbeak, System Infection Preventionist at Secours Mercy Health, and also the editor-in-chief of our sister podcast, Transmission Control. Garret, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. This is an exciting episode, Melanie. Thanks for having me on.
I'm super excited for this conversation today. And kind of as a reintroduction of our season, since we just kicked off last week, we kicked off season 17, and this season, the whole idea is to do some myth busting and challenge or tackle some of the ideas that are still hanging around, even though the research has probably shown them to be untrue or what we think about them just isn't exactly right. So for some of our interviews, we're going to really go deep and challenge those deeply held beliefs that are just not true anymore. And others were going to be more of a gentle reminder. But either way, we're going to be addressing science and discussing proven best practices in each of these episodes so that we can give the best patient care with the most up-to-date information out there. So today, we're talking about room temperature. And in the general public, for sure, there is this idea that an OR absolutely has to be cold, and the colder the OR, the better. Even with our staff, though, I encounter this thinking sometimes that just says the colder the OR, the better it is for preventing infection. And that's not necessarily true, and it depends on how we approach it and understand temperature management so we can really provide the best care for our patients. So, Garret, that is where you come in today as we talk about temperature management and approach it from an infection prevention standpoint. But first, I know you've been a guest on our show before, but everybody might not have met you. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So my role within Secours Mercy Health is as a system infection preventionist over medical device reprocessing. So sterile processing, endoscope, we work a lot in the OR. My background is in sterile processing, and I'm also a certified infection preventionist through CBIC. So anything related to the OR is pretty fascinating to me because it's a very nuts and bolts space in the hospital. And it's one where I'm one of the reasons I like this topic is there's a lot of I'll call them superstitions or kind of myths about what we do and how we do it and what's the best way to do it in the OR space.
So really getting into temperature and the myth versus the reality. What is our reality when we're talking about temperature management with our patients?
Yeah, so there's two kind of key caveats are kind of anchors to this conversation. One is promoting the patient's natural immune system, which is like probably our first consideration. That's why we do, pre-op antibiotics. That's why we encourage good skin hygiene, good skin prep, everything to help the patient's immune system do what it needs to do because it's about to undergo a traumatic experience with this procedure. And so when we think about temperature, one of the key considerations, and probably one that is more top of mind for the OR staff, is I want to keep this patient normothermic. I want to keep their body in a range with whether you use like a bear hugger, a warm blanket, warm saline, warm fluids, all of those things help to keep normothermia. Now, the caveat to that is not every procedure is going to require or be helpful to have normothermia. Certain procedures, we'll think like neurospine trauma, you may want a colder temperature. Other procedures, let's say it's a burn patient with over 20% area, you're going to want that room warmer. So it's not a cut and dry thing when we think about normothermia, but general broad strokes, you're getting a lap appy. We want to keep that patient warm and within that range their body can recover after the procedure as best as possible.
So then where did this idea come from that the room had to be super cold in order to protect the patient from infection?
Yeah, so it comes from one kind of scientific standpoint and then one just kind of human factors standpoint. The scientific piece is it's kind of comfortable in our brain to think germs grow when it's hot and muggy, and I think of the tropics and I think of bugs and everything like that. And of course, germs grow at body temperature, most of the germs, but we also have bacteria that grow at colder temperatures, things like Pseudomonas, and then we have germs that grow at much, much higher temperatures. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all. The other human factors thing that we think about with having a cold room is it's hot in the OR. You have the technology is much better now, but hot OR lights, hot PPE, you're in there with a lot of, bodies and just that temperature piece of it. There was also and we may want to kind of come back to this in more detail a little bit later on, but there was a really interesting study that was conducted that found that how OR staff rate their performance, they rate themselves as doing worse in the procedure when it's warmer as opposed to when it's colder in the room. And I think that's kind of a natural, again, very human. It's hot. I'm frustrated whether you're working on your car or doing something. It's like, it's too hot in here to even think.
Right. And if I'm working really hard and now I'm sweating and sweat is dripping down places it should not be, I must be doing a bad job because I'm running like crazy and this must be a terrible case. I can totally follow that train of thought.
Yeah, exactly. And then we have that sweating factor where if you're pouring sweat, and that's just kind of a logical thing that if you're sweating into the patient's, sterile field, we've contaminated it, we've compromised the sterile field, and we obviously don't want that to happen. But the kind of nuance of it is there's not a clear through line that having your room significantly colder or significantly warmer for that matter directly correlates to surgical site infections.
Interesting. So what I'm hearing, and I guess I connected the dots while you were talking a second ago, but what we have done, I think, is superimpose room temperature with patient temperature when it comes to surgical site infection or keeping the patient normothermic. It's almost as if we're depending upon the ambient temperature of the room to prevent something going on with the patient, right?
Right. That's exactly it. And it's also that perception of it's hot in here, the patient may be too hot, too cold, or vice versa, that we may say it's really hot in here, the patient may be fine, but on that table, well, if we have colder fluids running, the patient may be actually dropping their temperature significantly, even for a short procedure. And there's a guideline that lays this out really well from APIC called Understanding the OR Environment. And it's so if you listen to this episode and you're like, I want to kind of deep dive into this, this is a really helpful implementation guide about temperature, humidity, air handling, all in that OR setting.
And tell us, because we're very familiar with a lot of acronyms, but all of us don't know who APIC is. So who is APIC?
Yes, so that is the Association for Professionals in Infection Control.
All right, so that is your professional organization.
Yeah, so similar to AORN right. For the OR, and if I missaid that acronym, send me a real mean email so I'll remember it next time.
Okay. We can always edit it out. It's fine. But okay, so APIC addresses temperature management. AORN addresses temperature management. We have a lot of guidelines, but who actually sets the guidelines or the specifics for what maybe a recommended room temperature range is? Who determines that?
Yeah, so those guidelines come from ASHRAE, which is another acronym we hear a lot. And there was a big kind of committee council meeting between infection preventionists and OR experts and facilities, guidelines, institutions to say, what do we need to look at for a standard recommendation for the OR for sterile storage, and what should our temperature be? So the one that they settled on is generally between 68 and 75 degrees with a humidity range between 30 and 60%. Some humidity ranges will take it down to 20%, but then you have to think about the longevity of your sterile storage supplies. Also have to think about with a lower humidity, you're at a greater risk for fires in the OR, which is probably a more concrete and observed concern than somebody sweating into the sterile field and your patient getting sick a month later.
That's interesting. Yeah. So because the range that I had pulled up as I was preparing for this episode did say 20 to 60%, but they also brought up the risk of fire with your combustibles and anesthesia gases and whatnot within your OR at those lower humidities. So I'm okay with, moving it up to 30%. Just let's, maybe not have a fire. That would be fantastic.
Right.
I mean, all in a day's work, but let's not start a fire in the OR. But okay. So those are the recommended ranges. And like we talked about, there's always times when we're going to go below that, we're going to go beyond that. But there are allowances made, obviously, for the patient condition, for the patient's situation. And then there's also allowances actually in the guidelines. They mention personal comfort of the staff in the room. And so there are exceptions to be made. But what I find is really interesting is while they do allow for rooms being colder outside of recommended ranges, they always put the focus back on making sure the patient is maintaining normothermia. So how are the ways that we do that to make sure that we are keeping our patients warm?
Yeah, so there's a few different things that you can do, and I'll say it's multifaceted in how you approach normothermia. The first thing is making sure that your staff is aware of the game plan. So when you go into a room, the patient's going to be exposed for parts of it as they're draping and prepping. They're going onto a cold table generally because that room's had time to cool down between patients. And so we see a lot of bear huggers, again, warm running fluids. And then sometimes you'll see it where a warm blanket kind of gets thrown on in PACU to bring the temperature back up as quickly as possible. That may not always be sufficient. Usually those blankets lose temperature really quickly. And we want to make sure that we're accurately and actively monitoring that patient's temperature to get them, if they're below normothermia, let's say for a heart procedure, that we get them back up to normothermia in a pretty rapid way and that it's controlled so that it's something we're paying attention to.
Okay, so say we aren't paying attention and our patient does get too cold. How does the hyperthermia then affect our patient and their recovery?
Yeah, so when you have a hypothermic patient, your blood vessels all constrict, and that's why your fingers, start to look a little bit pale. And all of that blood rushes to your, core organs because your body thinks, all right, I'm in a cold environment, I got to go into survival mode, and it limits your body's natural effectiveness at responding to infection. You need that active exchange for healthy tissue and for immune response. So when we have too cold of a patient for too long, we're delaying the amount of time that that patient's immune system can work kind of at full capacity. And one of the ways to think about this is if you're going on a hike and you've got your water bottle full, but you are thirsty, the best way to keep from getting dehydrated is to drink water. It doesn't help you if you've got a full water bottle and you're passed out in the middle of Phoenix.
You never drank any of it, right?
You never drank any of it, yeah. So maintaining that patient's normothermia is the best method to keep it from getting variability. And when we look at a surgical site infection, one of the things that we're looking at is, was normothermia maintained during the procedure? And if it dropped, was it brought back up in your PACU area?
So is there anything else then when we look at the relationship then between patients that are hypothermic and then infection? Any other way the patient can be affected?
Yeah, so it'll depend on, the actual organism that you're presented with when you review a surgical site infection. And we know from some pretty great research that the patient's own kind of microbiome on their skin and in their gut are two of the bigger factors for what's going to affect them when it comes to an SSI. And so letting your body maintain normothermia and not diminishing that with either too hot or too cold is going to allow the body to jumpstart and have a better response for after the procedure.
So then if the patient does come to recovery and they're too cold or they're too hot, is there a kind of an average time that it takes a patient to come back up, even with our forced air warmers, bear huggers, whatever, things we can do? But is there kind of an average time that it takes a patient to get back to a normal temperature?
From an IP side, we look at what was the temperature in the first hour after they went back to recovery. And that's what we look at when we review an SSI. It doesn't change the category or the criteria, but it's one of those things we look at during surveillance to see, was there an opportunity here? Or the bigger thing that we see sometimes is, was their temperature even documented during that period? So you'll see sometimes super crazy high temperatures that makes you think that the thermometer was like recording right under a heat source. And then sometimes you see super low and you're like, this patient was not 40 degrees when they took their first temperature. The accuracy of the documentation is always something we look at too.
Okay, so that actually just made me think about the heat sources and then actually the times that we get our patients too hot. I mean, obviously we're very concerned about getting them too cold, but what about the flip side? What if we overwarm our patients and they are too hot? What happens then?
Yeah, certain procedures, the patient should be cooled off, and it can even reduce the risk of ongoing nerve damage if they're cooled off. So again, we think of those neurotrauma cases. Now with those, we also want to be mindful of the patient sweating. It's unlikely in a cold OR where they're not wrapped up in a Snuggie, but if they're sweating, if the patient is too hot, that also is going to have an effect on the risk of contamination from their own kind of natural microbiome to the incision point.
Yeah, so we had a patient one time, and it was the first time I'd ever seen a patient just dripping with sweat after we took the drapes down. And this was an orthopedic case. It wasn't a specific case where we had the room extra hot. We actually had it cooler like we usually have the rooms. But we start pulling drapes off, and I mean, she was just drenched in sweat. And the bear hugger had been on and it had been blowing. And I'm like, that was too much hot. I mean, she was really hot. So then you worry, okay, well, we got her really hot. She sweated the whole time. And obviously she couldn't tell us she was sweating and probably uncomfortable. But then we're like, oh, we got to cool her down, make her stop sweating. But we don't think about that one as much, I don't think, the flip side, as we do concern with getting them too cold. But it's interesting to think about both sides of the coin when it comes to temperature management.
That's a really good kind of example of treating the monitor, not the patient, because you might go through that procedure and say our temperature was in range. We didn't have to do a variance form or a risk assessment or anything like that. And so we're not really concerned about the patient getting too hot or too cold. So that visual and, checkup on the patient tells you something that the monitor is not going to.
Right. Putting your eyes on the patient. And that obviously, I'm not at the head of the bed. I'm not the anesthesia provider. And the drapes, there's so many drapes and they cover everything. So obviously you got to lift up the drapes. You got to look at the patient, just like we are instructed to do the same with extremities and other things throughout the case, just to check and make sure nothing's fallen off the bed or anything else. But yeah, it is a don't treat the monitor, treat the patient kind of scenario for sure. Now we also talking about sweating and people being too hot. I was actually in a ortho spine case once, and we had to keep the room really cold, mostly because our surgeon was very, very hot natured and he would get super, super sweaty. And one time, he's sweating and you try to help keep sweat from dripping and whatnot, and a drop of sweat, like you couldn't catch it, just boop, right down into the wound. Like, oh no. Have you ever encountered a situation where the surgeon or staff was like, a sweat drop just dropped off of me onto the patient. I mean, we treated it, we documented it, and it moved on, and the patient was fine. But that's kind of a terrifying situation when you have sweat dropping off of your head onto your patient.
Yeah, it really is. And it's one of those that, like, we can see it functionally being really, like, awful and kind of heart-stopping. There's not good evidence that anything like that directly results or correlates to an increased SSI. You can always use, like, personal cooling vests, which are a pain, and you're in these procedures for a long, long time. So we don't see too many of them. We've got a couple of surgeons who they run hot and they have a cooling vest. And we have a process for, what happens with it after the case and maintaining it. But there's also the piece to consider that certain procedures outside of comfort, some of the materials that you're working with, ortho is a great example of that. If you're extending the case because you can't get your bone cement to work and go where you need it to go because the room is too hot, that is also a patient risk. And so this is where, and I'll tattle on IPs a little bit here, because there's so many variable factors, and we want things pretty cut and dry to say, hey, don't change the temperature outside of these very specific circumstances. We want that locus of control really, really close. So sometimes, I don't want to say we overblow the risk of temperature variances or going a little bit colder for a heart case or a little bit colder when you've got a lot of, like, a total joint where you're going to be using, a fair bit of bone cement. But everything in IP has to have some nuance to it. So we have to be able to talk to our OR folks, and we have to be able to say, hey, this variance form was filed. Walk me through the case. What factors did you see? Educate me on the circumstance that you saw in the patient so that I, as an IP, am not going in there and saying, you really didn't need to make the room colder or hotter because of this, where I'm not as close to the patient as the OR team is. And so it's just a good opportunity to say, go through those variance forms with your OR team. And instead of sending like a little email, just
a little
to say,
nastygram that says, your room was too cold. Yeah.
Yeah, your room is, and this is the 8th time that this one doc has asked for a variance. Go in there and talk to him and say, does this doctor do more of a certain type of case? Do they have enough staff to, get the bone cement on there in a timely manner? And so there's other factors that we want to look at outside of just, hey, the room went up by 2 degrees. All of your patients are going to die. We can't have that approach with it.
Right.
Yeah.
Common sense and understanding the multifaceted clinical nature of each of our surgical patients, I think, is what's key. But you really did hit on a really good point. But it's important to have that interdisciplinary team where infection prevention can talk to the OR and sterile processing, and everybody is involved and everybody brings a bit of expertise to this conversation so that together we do work together to provide the best patient care, but then also to track down outliers or things that might be an issue that we think might be an issue so that we can address them, for our patient safety and for future patient care. And as we are coming to an end to this conversation already, because it goes by way too fast, it's interesting to think about temperature management and the variable nature of it and how there's a lot of nuance, there is gray area, but the fact that we do need to keep the patient as our primary focus and make sure that we are keeping them warm, normothermic, and the room temperature we can be comfortable, but we still need to pay attention to our parameters. So I would like to give you back the mic, though, for any other final thoughts before we close the conversation. Just anything else you want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
Yeah, I think as a general kind of always to have at the front of mind as IP is the research and the evidence-based practice. So go to the source. Don't just say this has to be this way. Understand your patient population. And we've talked a lot about temperature, but relative humidity plays a role in that too, where you can get to a point where your room is cold and your relative humidity is actually higher, and that can lead to condensation and pathway to break a sterile field or sterile supplies that are in the room. But it also changes how the staff perceives the temperature in the room. And kind of counterintuitively, you can reduce that relative humidity by a slight increase of the temperature. So that's a factor. So we always want to think of like, what's upstream of this issue? Are HVAC systems working? Does the staff, are they frustrated because it's a tough case and they didn't get their stuff on time? And so now, even though the temperature only went up 1 degree, are we perceiving that we're doing a really bad job? And so providing that education to the OR to say, hey, there's this great study about perception of temperature. There's this great study about the feel of the room when relative humidity is too high. All of those things are elements that IP can bring into the conversation with the OR staff to get to like a root cause solution.
I love that. And then once again, we're working together as a team, providing the education to our team, and then taking what's best practice, taking the resources that we have, the research available, and applying that best practice to our patients. So Garret, thank you so much for helping us discuss this myth and idea of cold ORs and what it really means and what it really looks like. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much.
That was Garret Hollenbeak, System Infection Preventionist at Secours Mercy Health, and also the editor-in-chief of our sister podcast, Transmission Control. And if you want to tune into anything and everything infection prevention related to surgical services, check out the Transmission Control podcast. Garret is a wonderful host and does a fantastic job bringing in guests to talk about just all things infection prevention. And it was a pleasure to have him on the show today as we talked about temperature management in the OR and really bringing it back to focus that the room temperature is important. We have temperature ranges for sure, but also remembering that the priority focus is the patient, and the room can be a certain temperature, but we have to make sure we're maintaining the patient's body temperature in a normothermic range and focusing on that priority. And that primarily will help us make sure that we keep our patients warm, even when we cool the rooms down or warm them up based on what's going on with the procedure. So that's going to do it for this week's episode. Stay tuned next week as we discuss the relationship, or lack thereof, between shellfish allergy and iodine-based PrEP solutions. You really don't want to miss this conversation. On behalf of Chris, myself, and our whole team, thanks for listening to this week's episode of First Case.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of First Case. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to First Case on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for First Case in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@firstcasemedia.com. We look forward to hearing from you.